At the beginning of the Cold War, a conflict in Korea would bring soldiers from the United States and China to fight it out in the treacherous terrain of the Korean peninsula. But by December of 1950, the Chinese forces had the American Marines surrounded and outnumbered. The situation looked bleak, but chew-een, the first Asian American officer in Marine history, would lead his men on a daring mission to save the Marines from certain destruction. Lee was born in San Francisco and raised in Sacramento, California. His parents, Mr. and Mrs. M. Young Lee, sent their children, 3 sons and daughters, to Chinese schools and observed Chinese customs. Kurt and his younger brothers practiced with guns early in their childhood as they hunted to provide food for their family. Kurt was always the one who used the gun, but he led his brothers similarly to how he led his fellow Marines later in life. His inspiration to join the military came primarily from the junior ROTC program he joined in high school that taught him the importance of leadership and discipline. When Lee graduated, he volunteered to join the Marine Corps because they were the first ones to battle. However, much to his disappointment, Lee would not be going to the front lines of World War II. He was instead assigned a job at the Japanese language school. After the war, Lee would rise to become a lieutenant, thus making him the first Asian American officer in the Marine Corps. With tensions growing on the Korean peninsula between the Soviet-supported North Korea and the US-backed South Korea, Lee approached his first opportunity to fight. On June 25, 1950, about 90,000 soldiers of the North Korean People's Army, supported with 150 deadly Soviet T-34 tanks, crossed the 38th parallel, dividing the two countries. The lightly armed South Korean troops were no match for this powerful foe. While President Harry Truman encouraged the United Nations to strike back, the North Koreans steadily advanced. By August, the South Koreans had been pushed back to a 60 by 90 mile section of Korea known as the Purcell perimeter. While South Korea crumbled, Marines began organizing in California. When he arrived, Lee was determined not to get a desk job like he had in World War II. Therefore, he worked hard and took command of a machine gun platoon in Baker Company. However, many Americans were not expecting a Chinese-American officer at any position. Pat Burris said that he was surprised when he first saw Lieutenant Lee because he was expecting a white man. Just like most of the other soldiers, Burris had never seen a Chinese-American Marine. Burris also remembered,
"I heard him referred to very derogatory a number of times. I heard him mentioned as our Chinese laundryman. I heard him referred to as the Chinaman."
Nevertheless, Lee demanded respect from his men and wanted his men to have pride for their company. On the voyage across the Pacific, Lee trained his men on the deck of the ship to make sure that they would be ready for the war, despite what they thought of him. General Douglas MacArthur, the commander of the Asian Theater, decided to use these new soldiers to launch an amphibious assault at Incheon. However, Lee would not get a chance to take part in this first battle, much to his discontent. His company instead was placed in charge of cleaning up the ship. The Incheon landings were a success, and the American and South Korean forces quickly pushed the North Koreans back towards the 38th parallel, liberating Seoul on September 27th. Lee and his men helped clear the area around Seoul. One time, during the clearing of Seoul, Lee's troops were passing through the countryside. Some of his men began tearing down a farmer's vineyard trellises to use as kindling. Lee knew that the farmer would barely have enough wood to survive the winter, and he strictly ordered his men not to touch anything, and none of his men dared to challenge him. These Incheon and Seoul operations were a huge success. South Korea had been liberated, and the North Korean People's Army had been crushed. In their next step, President Truman and General MacArthur met at Wake Island on October 15th to decide how far the American forces should advance north and to discuss what were the chances that the Chinese or Soviet forces would interfere. Arthur was confident that the Chinese would not get involved because the United States' forces would be far superior to theirs. However, the Chinese did not like the thought of a democratic, capitalist country on their border and warned the United States not to cross the 38th parallel. And Chairman Mao Zedong ordered 300,000 Chinese troops to move into North Korea under cover of darkness. The American forces continued to march north, the 8th Army on the western side and the Marines on the east. One group of Marines encountered Chinese forces on November 2nd at Sudong, and word spread to Baker Company fast. Now Kurt Lee, a Chinese American, would be faced against a Chinese enemy. Robert Stanovsky, a machine gunner in Baker Company, said that
nobody thought that he wouldn't kill a Chinese man because he was a Marine.
That night, the Chinese attacked, and the Marine camp was thrown into chaos. The gunfire suddenly stopped, and Kurt Lee realized the Marines didn't know where the enemy was. He reorganized his men and told them to watch for muzzle flashes. He then decided to advance up a slope and draw the enemy fire.
What I did was use these weapons to fire at an irregular rate as if different people were firing weapons.
The Chinese fell for his trick and returned fire, revealing their position. Then Lee, in a further extent of his quick reactions, shouted, "Don't shoot," in Chinese, in order to make the men think that he was a Chinese soldier. When he reached the top of the slope, he discovered that the Chinese had abandoned their position. His brave actions earned him the Navy Cross, the second highest military decoration. However, that morning, Lee was shot in his right elbow and sent to a hospital in Ham Hung. Lee hated the hospital, but what he despised more was being away from the action that he longed to be a part of. One day, he was taking a walk with William Keller, a mortar section leader who had also been injured. They found a Jeep with the keys in the ignition. They slipped into the vehicle and, ignoring the protests from other drivers, escaped from the hospital and returned to the front. General MacArthur and Edward Almond, the commander of the 10th Corps, arrogantly believed that China had not intervened in the war, and that these Chinese soldiers were simply volunteers. The Marines continued to march up to and around the Chew-een Reservoir. On November 25th, Kurt Lee and his men had reached Udom-ni, and most of the Marine forces were scattered around the Chew-een Reservoir. By this time, 120,000 Chinese soldiers had moved around the Marine positions and were preparing for an attack. On the night of November 27th, the Chinese attacked the Marines' positions and chaos erupted around the ridge. Despite the Chinese's overwhelming numbers, the Marines took a stand and held their positions. At Tok Tong Pass, Fox Company lost 20 soldiers, but estimated that they killed as many as 450 Chinese. However, it was clear that the Marines could not hold out forever. General Oliver P. Smith decided that the Marines on the west side of the reservoir would return down to the main service road of Hugoruri. The service road was controlled by the Americans, but the 240 Marines at Fox Company that were defending the Tok Tong Pass desperately needed reinforcements. It was decided that Kurt Lee would lead 500 Marines from Udom-ni to relieve Fox Company. Kurt would have to guide these men about 9 miles through mountainous terrain in the snow at night. Star shells fired from Udom-ni were supposed to provide light for the marching soldiers, but they were ineffective, forcing Lee to use scouts and a compass to navigate the treacherous area. During the march, Lee suddenly heard Chinese voices. He prepared his men and led them up a hill to overrun the Chinese position. The Chinese were taken by surprise, and the battle was over in minutes. Lee continued to push his exhausted Marines, and by morning, they were less than a mile from Fox Company. However, there was another pocket of Chinese resistance blocking them from the pass. The Marines removed the remaining Chinese, and on December 2nd, they had made it to Fox Company. Now Tok Tong Pass had been secured, and the U.S. forces could begin evacuating to the port of Hungnam. Although 600 Americans were killed in the fighting around the reservoir, and the Marines were forced to abandon their position, Lee's brave actions would ensure that almost 4,000 wounded could be brought out alive, and thousands more could be led to fight from a better position. If these Marines could not have escaped, they would have been killed or captured by the Chinese, and the U.S. might have given up on the conflict in Korea. Even though he led with great influence and intellect, it would be the last battle of the Korean War Kurt Lee would take a part of. On December 8th, Lee was struck by a burst of fire in the face and the arm and would be evacuated to Japan. After the Korean War, Kurt Lee would rise to the rank of major. During Vietnam, Lee would be the chief rifle tactics instructor at the basic school to help prepare the young men for the fighting they would soon experience. Kurt Chew-een Lee died on March 3, 2014, at the age of 88, but his legacy of leadership and action would not be forgotten.